Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a really crucial journey through the core plumbing of the pelvis. We are taking Chapter 73 from Gray's Anatomy, which focuses entirely on the lower urinary tract, so the bladder, prostate, and urethra, and we're going to build a complete mental map. Our mission really is to transform that dense anatomical text into a clear visual blueprint. We want you to be able to visualize the spatial relationships, understand the layers, and crucially, know exactly why those relationships define clinical outcomes, whether it's surgical access, disease spread, or trauma patterns. This is all about mapping the 3D architecture in your mind.
And that visualization is just paramount. I mean, these structures manage fundamental processes, storing urine and ensuring controlled voluntary elimination. We have to define the dynamic changes in that bladder reservoir, understand how it interfaces with the specialized outflow structures, particularly the prostate in males, and maybe most importantly, pinpoint the delicate nerve pathways that govern continence for every single person.
Okay, let's start at the reservoir itself, the bladder. It is anything but static. It's defined by its contents. So how do we picture its transformation from empty to full?
Well, when it's empty, the bladder is small and sort of tetrahedral, tucked entirely within the protective confines of the lesser pelvis. But as it starts filling, its walls stretch and it quickly changes shape, becoming ovoid. And critically, it then expands superiorly, rising up and actually entering the greater or abdominal cavity. This movement is key for clinical access, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Right. And to structure that visualization, we need those 4 key divisions.
Yes. So start at the bottom, the neck. This is the lowest and most fixed point where the bladder meets the urethra. Then you move posterior inferiorly to the fundus, that's the base, and superiorly the main body. Finally, the apex points towards the pubic symphysis.
Now, the fundus, that base, is where the external anatomical relations differ drastically between the sexes. And those differences are just absolutely critical.
They are. I mean, think of the fundus as the posterior wall. In females, this wall sits directly against the anterior vaginal wall. Superiorly, the peritoneum reflects off the bladder onto the uterus, creating the shallow vesicouterine pouch.
And in males?
It's a bit more complex. The male fundus is related to the rectum, but it's separated into 2 parts. Superiorly, you have the deeper rectovesical pouch, which is covered by peritoneum, and then inferiorly, you have the seminal glands and the ductus deferens. And what anchors and protects this whole region is a dense layer of fascia. It's known as the prostato-seminal fascia, or Denon-Villiers fascia.
Ah, Denon-Villiers fascia, so famous in surgery. Is it true that its importance stems from being a kind of natural barrier?
Precisely. Its density allows surgeons during, say, a prostatectomy to cleanly dissect and separate the prostate and seminal glands from the rectal wall. It acts as a critical protective layer. It limits the posterior spread of disease, like prostate cancer, into the rectum.
Okay, let's tie these relations directly to trauma. How does knowing where that peritoneum sits influence how we treat a bladder injury?
It's the difference between a contained injury and a potential catastrophe. See, only the triangular superior surface of the bladder is covered by peritoneum. If trauma breaches that superior surface, the injury is intraperitoneal. Urine spills into the abdominal cavity.
So risk of peritonitis.
Exactly, which demands immediate open surgical repair. But if the injury involves the infralateral surfaces, which are extraperitoneal, the urine is contained locally within the retropubic tissues, and that injury can often be managed conservatively without immediate surgery.
This leads perfectly to our surgical safe zone, the suprapubic access. How does a full bladder let us puncture it without hitting the peritoneum?
What's fascinating here is just the mechanics of distension. When the bladder fills dramatically, its expansion forces that superior surface upward. In doing so, it physically pulls the parietal peritoneum superiorly, lifting it off the anterior abdominal wall right above the pubic symphysis.
Creating a gap.
It creates a safety corridor, the retropubic space of Retzius, and we can insert a tube, a suprapubic cystostomy, through the abdominal wall and into the bladder without ever entering the peritoneal cavity. This can be a safe zone extending 5, 6, even 7 centimeters above the pubic bone when the bladder is maximally full.
And holding all of this in place are those key fibrous anchors.
The neck, remember, is the most fixed point. It's stabilized by thickened pelvic fascia forming the puboprostatic ligaments in males and the pubovesical ligaments in females. We also have to picture the median umbilical ligament, the remnant of the fetal urachus, which runs straight up from the apex of the bladder to the umbilicus.
That's a key developmental remnant, right? The bladder is actually abdominal at birth.
Exactly. It only descends into the true pelvis as we age.
Let's move inside the reservoir now and explore the lining. Most of the internal lining, the mucosa, is loosely attached. It forms folds or rugae when empty. But then there's that one region that is completely different, the trigone.
The trigone is structurally fixed. It's always smooth even when the bladder is completely empty. It's a triangle, and its points are defined by function. Antero-inferiorly is the internal urethral orifice, and the two posterolateral points are the urethric orifices.
And how do we visualize the superior boundary of that triangle?
It's defined by the slightly curved interatoric crest. And what's important here is that this crest isn't just a fold. It's formed by the specific arrangement of muscle fibers. It's the continuation of the internal longitudinal muscle of the ureter extending right into the bladder wall.
And the placement of those ureteric orifices,
Yeah.
the fact they're 2.5 centimeters apart when empty but double when full, that solves the problem of preventing reflux, doesn't it?
It's brilliant mechanical engineering. The distal ureter doesn't just poke straight into the bladder, it passes obliquely through the muscular wall for about 1.5 to 2 centimeters.
The intramural part.
The intramural passage, yes. And it ensures that as the bladder fills and intravesical pressure increases, that pressure automatically compresses the ureter shut. It acts as a passive flat valve and stops urine from backing up toward the kidneys.
That is an essential safeguard. So taking this down to the microscopic level, what are the key features of that specialized lining, the urothelium?
Well, the urothelium is the specialized transitional epithelium. It's 4 to 7 cells thick when it's relaxed, and then it thins out dramatically when the bladder is distended. The real star here is the superficial layer of large, flat umbrella cells. These cells contain highly organized, packed protein particles called AUMs, or asymmetrical unit membranes. They form an incredibly tough, almost impermeable barrier.
Preventing the toxic stuff in urine from getting back into the bloodstream.
Precisely.
And what about the muscle layer, the engine?
Below the thin connective tissue layer, the lamina propria, we find the main engine, the muscularis propria, which we call the detrusor muscle. It's typically described as having 3 indistinct layers: inner longitudinal, intermediate circular, and outer longitudinal, and its coordinated contraction is what expels urine.
So if that muscle is obstructed, let's say by an enlarged prostate, what's the inevitable visual outcome?
Well, if there is chronic outflow obstruction, the detrusor has to generate much higher pressures to push urine out. This workload leads to hypertrophy. The muscle wall thickens. And when we look at the interior of a bladder like that, we see a thick, irregular wall because the mucosa is forced out between the hypertrophied muscle bundle.
Creating little pockets.
Little outpocketings called diverticula. And this state is known clinically as a trabeculated bladder. It signals chronic high pressure, and it often leads to incomplete emptying and eventually harmful back pressure on the kidneys.
Okay, shifting to the male-specific structure, the prostate. This is the globular fibromuscular gland right beneath the bladder neck, acting as a hub for both the urinary and genital tracts. What are its defining spatial relations?
It's roughly the size of a large walnut, about 4 centimeters wide, and it lies immediately anterior to the rectal ampulla, which is why it's digitally palpable. Structurally, it's enclosed by the prostatic fascia, which is a condensation of the endopelvic fascia. And we have to re-emphasize the non-Villiers fascia here, which stabilizes it posteriorly from the rectum.
Okay.
But surprisingly, while it has this fascial enclosure, it actually lacks a true, defined fibrous capsule, especially at the base and apex.
Right. And if we're looking at a slice of the prostate, the key insight isn't the old description of lobes, but the 3 distinct internal zones. This is what dictates where disease strikes.
Absolutely. We break it down by probability and function. First, the peripheral zone, which constitutes a massive 70% of the gland's volume. Visualize this as the outer shell. And critically, this is where the vast majority of prostatic carcinomas arise.
So cancer is an outer zone disease. Where does the benign enlargement happen?
That's the transition zone. It's small, only about 5% of the volume, and it surrounds the distal intramural urethra. This is the sole site where benign prostatic hyperplasia, BPH, originates and grows,
Compressing the urethra.
compressing it inwards and causing all the symptoms. And then finally, we have the central zone, about 25%, which surrounds the ejaculatory ducts and is rarely involved in either BPH or cancer.
The apex of the prostate is a really high-stakes zone for surgery, especially when removing the gland. How does the structure of the apex relate to preserving continence?
It's about millimeters. The prostate apex abuts the most crucial muscle for continence, the external urethral sphincter. Surgeons have to navigate this space so delicately. And since the gland swells and changes shape from that small croissant shape in youth to a larger donut in older age, the incision for a radical prostatectomy must be precise to free the gland without damaging that external sphincter.
Which would lead to severe incontinence.
Devastating incontinence.
And finally, that vital connection to genital function. Why is the prostate essential in preventing retrograde ejaculation?
The nerves come via the prostatic plexus, and the smooth muscle collar at the bladder neck, the internal urethral sphincter, has rich sympathetic innervation. During the sympathetic stimulation that causes seminal emission, this collar must contract powerfully and simultaneously.
To close the gate.
To close the bladder neck, yeah. It diverts semen forward and prevents it from flowing backward, or retrograde, into the bladder. That's also why damage to the nearby neurovascular bundles during surgery carry such a high risk of impotence.
Let's follow the conduit now. The male urethra, an impressive 18 to 20 centimeters long. We divide this lengthy pathway into the posterior urethra, which is short and rigid, and the anterior urethra, long and mobile.
The posterior urethra is only about 4 to 5 centimeters. It starts with the tiny 1 centimeter intramural part in the bladder wall, then the 3 to 4 centimeter prostatic urethra running through the prostate. This is the busiest section, packed with anatomical landmarks.
How do we visualize those internal prostatic landmarks?
Look for the midline ridge running along the posterior wall. That's the urethral crest. Right in the middle of that crest is a large mound called the seminal colliculus, or the verumontanum. This colliculus is a critical surgical landmark, often used as a stopping point in procedures like a tour P.
Okay.
It holds the opening of the prostatic utricle, a small pouch, homologous to the female uterus and vagina, and the two slit-like openings where the ejaculatory ducts deposit sperm.
Past the prostatic section, we hit the membranous urethra.
The membranous urethra. It's the shortest, narrowest, and least dilatable part. It passes through the dense perineal membrane and is surrounded by the large, prominent outer layer of striated muscle that forms the primary voluntary control structure, the external urethral sphincter.
The remaining 16 centimeters, the anterior urethra, runs through the corpus spongiosum of the penis, and it terminates in that dilation at the glands, the navicular fossa.
Now, let's revisit trauma, because the male urethra is highly susceptible to injury. We really need to visualize the spatial implications of a fall astride injury, which often ruptures the bulbar part of the urethra.
So how does the surrounding anatomy dictate where the urine goes when the urethra breaks?
This is a classic example of fascial containment. If the spongy urethra is ruptured, urine extravasates out of the tube. However, the deep fascia of the perineum, specifically callus fascia, is securely attached to the ischiopubic rami and the perineal membrane. This anchoring is key.
So it acts like a wall.
It acts like an impenetrable wall, preventing urine from tracking backward into the lesser pelvis or the thighs.
So what's the path of least resistance for that escaped urine?
It is forced to track anteriorly. It spreads into the loose connective tissue of the scrotum, up the penis, and can track all the way up beneath the skin of the anterior abdominal wall. You can see massive swelling in those superficial regions, but it rarely spreads past the pelvis posteriorly.
Moving to the female anatomy, which is dramatically shorter, about 4 centimeters long, 6 millimeters wide, running anteroinferiorly, and embedded in the wall of the vagina.
Yeah.
Given the prostate is absent, how does the mechanism for maintaining continence differ so fundamentally from the male system?
This is a crucial anatomical distinction. The smooth muscle coat in the female urethra lacks that robust, defined circular component that we see in the male internal urethral sphincter. So female continence relies much more heavily on extrinsic support structures.
How do we visualize that support system?
You need to picture a sling. The bladder neck is stabilized by those strong pubovesical ligaments anchoring it to the pubis. But the active dynamic support comes from the floor of the pelvis, specifically the levator ani muscle complex.
Right.
The puboanalis portion of this muscle complex acts to elevate the urethra and compress it against the relatively fixed, rigid anterior vaginal wall. It generates the necessary closing pressure.
So it's a mechanism of compression and sling support, not a dense intrinsic sphincter.
Exactly.
And before we move on, what are those important glandular structures associated with the female urethra?
Near the external opening are the paraurethral glands, also known as Skene's glands. These are significant due to their potential for inflammation or cyst formation. Blood supply comes primarily from the vaginal and inferior vesical arteries, draining eventually to the internal and external iliac lymph nodes.
Finally, we arrive at the control system. Micturition is a perfect example of complex neurological integration, dividing into the two phases, storage and voiding. Let's start with how the body handles the storage phase.
During storage, the bladder accommodates a growing volume, often up to 400–500 milliliters, with only a slight rise in pressure. This is partly viscoelastic properties, but mostly active neurological control. Central gating mechanisms in the spinal cord actively inhibit the parasympathetic drive that would normally cause contraction.
And the nerves telling us we're full.
The afferent nerves telling us about fullness travel back via visceral afferents in the T10, L2, and S2, S4 segments.
What flips that switch from storage to the active voiding phase?
That decision is made higher up in the brainstem by the micturition center or the M center in the rostral pons. When we consciously decide to go, the pons overcomes that inhibition. It drives massive parasympathetic stimulation via S2, S4, releasing acetylcholine that results in a powerful, sustained detrusor muscle contraction.
And simultaneously, the pons has to turn off the storage centers and relax that voluntary sphincter muscle.
Absolutely. The pontine storage center, the L center, is inhibited, leading to relaxation of the external urethral sphincter. And what's fascinating about the sphincter muscle is that its striated fibers are unusually small diameter and slow twitch. They are designed for endurance.
So they can stay contracted for a long time.
They're capable of sustained long-term contraction all day long to ensure continence until the moment the M center gives the signal to relax.
And one last clinical correlation on those afferent signals. If a patient loses feeling below the waist, do they also lose the sense of needing to urinate?
This is a beautiful piece of neurological anatomy. Awareness of bladder filling the visceral sensation travels up the dorsal columns of the spinal cord. This is distinct from pain pathways. So, patients who undergo an anterolateral chordotomy to relieve intractable pain, which spares the dorsal columns, still retain the crucial awareness of when their bladder is full. So, to tie this entire deep dive together, we have explored the three structural pillars of the lower urinary tract. We have the highly dynamic bladder, which utilizes a brilliant passive valve system, the zonal prostate, whose structure dictates the pattern of the most common diseases, BPH and cancer, and the urethras, which show radically different lengths and crucially distinct continence mechanisms defined by their anatomical support systems.
And this entire system, from the dense fascial barriers like Dennevilliers and Colles to the specialized microscopic umbrella cells, operates under a precise, tiny neurological switch in the pons. It's a remarkable integration of macroscopic architecture and microcellular specialization, all working seamlessly to protect the kidney while maintaining social continence.
If you reflect on the complexity of that pontine switch, it allows us to simultaneously inhibit a powerful muscle contraction, the detrusor, while maintaining a separate sustained muscle contraction, the external sphincter, for hours on end. That degree of integrated autonomic control is far more complex than the reflexes governing your heart or lungs. It's a powerful illustration of the hierarchy of control in the central nervous system.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the anatomical bedrock of the bladder, prostate, and urethra. We hope this visualization aids your understanding of this essential and clinically demanding region. Keep digging deeper.